Florida, where Walter Gully Jr. serves as our 18th most worshipful Grand Master. Now that I got that out the way. There's been a symbiotic relationship between Edward Waters College and the Prince Hall Masons in Jacksonville, Florida. This relationship goes back to the 3rd Regiment that was stationed right here in Jacksonville, Florida, the 1st Carolina Volunteers, which became the 33rd Regiment in Fernandina, where most of these gentlemen settled in Jacksonville, Florida. And as a matter of fact, while I was doing that, every single president and trustee board member from the beginning, from Charles Pierce all the way to Henry Y. Toops, was a member of the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge of Florida. So, this is a picture of the trustee board of Edward Waters College in 1893. This group of men were probably the most influential black men in the entire country. We're going to start with, we have Bishop in the right corner, Bishop Morris Marcellus Moore. Next to him is the Honorable Senator Thomas Warren Long. You have Bishop Barnett, and you have Samuel Coleman. So why Samuel Coleman? Samuel Coleman was the head of the AME Church Education Committee in 1866. In one of the letters, he writes a letter to Frederick Douglass while he was the president and trustee at Wilberforce University to get the funds to start the school at Live Oak, Florida. Simultaneously, John Scott Sr. was the Florida House of Representatives, was almost going to be the Sergeant of Arms before he passed away because he died in chambers, but they started the Divinity School through Reverend Ross, which actually started in Ada Braddock and Pembroke Braddock's living room. Before St. Paul AME Church was a church, it was actually in the Pembroke Braddock family's living room where they used to hold services because they were actually probably the wealthiest family in the villa at the time. You also have Bishop Abraham Grant, who was an advisor to Howard Taft, William McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt. The story that Booker T. Washington was the first man to dine at the White House is a lie. It was actually Bishop Grant. He actually toured with the private carriage. They didn't have limousines yet. But they actually toured Arlington Cemetery to pay tribute to African American soldiers, the United States Colored Infantry, together in his carriage. This is probably the Michael Jordan, or your younger people, Lamar Jackson, right? He was the rock star of Florida. Let me tell you a little bit of background while you read the slides so I can get as much in as possible. Right up the street, walking distance from here, was called the Roberts Plantation. It was a sugarcane plantation. He was a minister and a slave on this plantation. When he found out that the 1st Carolina Volunteers were in Fernandina, under the cover of midnight, he kissed his wife and children goodbye and hoofed it on foot the 30 miles to Yulee. Ends up enlisting and musters into the United States Colored Infantry, where he becomes a minister for the 33rd Regiment. At the Battle of Olustee, which was the largest Civil War battle that took place in Florida, he actually was the one that prayed with the soldiers, white and black, before that battle. Then took a suicide mission to go and blow up some of the wooden bridges so the Confederates could not bring the cannon fire. Now, even though the Union lost that battle, it would have been a complete and utter disaster if they had gotten the cannons through the marshes out by Lake City. Afterwards, he settles in La Villa, one of the first settlers in La Villa, gets involved in Jacksonville city politics, works his way up all the way to be a senator for the Florida State Senate, and was actually the last African American to serve as such. They should make a movie about Thomas Warren Long. Matter of fact, one of the other most important things was African ancestry was very important to him, and he knew, if you read the writings of Charles Sumner Long, that his father was actually captured as a Zulu from the Zulu tribe and brought through the Middle Passage. And he always carried that with him. That he wanted to make sure his son, Charles Sumner Long, knew his African ancestry. This song actually was written in a diary by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was the commanding officer of the 1st Carolina of the 33rd United States Colored Infantry, who wrote this down and put it in his memoirs 30 years later. If we hadn't become soldiers, all might have come back as it was before. Our freedom might have slipped through the 2 houses of Congress, and President Lincoln's 4 years would have passed by and done nothing for us. But things that can never go back, because we have showed our energy, our courage, and our natural manhood. Another thing, it is always supposed to be a freedom, excuse me, another thing is that you kept your freedom without enlisting in the army. Your children made it grown-up freedom, the well-cultivated, would have always been flung in their faces. Your father did not fight for his own freedom. And what could you have answered? Never can you say this to the African race no more. This is John Scott Jr. He's actually the first president under the name Edward Waters College, so we can clear that up when people say who's the first president. He has a completely different background. His father was the collector of taxes at the Jacksonville Customs House, and during that time, if you know anything about the movie Lincoln, holding a position at the Customs House was the highest patronage position you could get through the Republican Party at the time. So he ends up becoming a very well-educated man, having his father been involved in politics locally and on a state level. W.A.P. Ross actually said that he was probably the most learned man in the state. They considered him the great Hebrew scholar. So he had a completely different background from Thomas Warren Long, but his affinity for this school and his father actually being one of the pastors of St. Paul AME Church, you can see that this lineage is taking place with Edward Waters College. This is Judge Lee. There would never have been a Thurgood Marshall. There would never have been Daniel Webster Perkins. There would never have been the first Chief Justice, Jerry Leander Shaw, the first Supreme Court Justice for the state of Florida, without having Joseph Lee. Joseph Lee comes from a completely other different background. He's a carpetbagger, graduated from Howard University, and back then, the only reason why African Americans could serve on the bar in Florida is that Howard University made sure all its graduates were part of the United States Bar, Supreme Court Bar. So that way they were automatically included to serve at the bar on the local level, because it wasn't until 30 years later that James Weldon Johnson is actually the first African American to pass the Florida bar. He also is in charge of the Republican Party for almost 50 years. You know, everybody talks about the Great Compromise of 1877, but don't get it twisted. La Villa and Jacksonville politics was still dominated by African Americans all the way into the 1920s. Judge Lee was a power broker. He's on the committee that nominates Ulysses S. Grant, Howard Taft, William McKinley, and Theodore Roosevelt. So he's actually probably one of the most powerful men in the country. He's actually very good friends with W.E.B. Du Bois. So you see a lot of the crisis magazines in the early days of the early 1900s, you'll see Judge Lee's name being repeated over and over and over again. If you read James Weldon Johnson's biography along the way, who does he pay tribute to? Judge Lee. One of the greatest civil rights attorneys in history is a forgotten man here in Jacksonville. His name was J. Douglas Wetmore, who his dad was the first marshal. Also was the first African American to be on the city council. Another one he pays tribute to, Judge Lee. Judge Lee was probably the most well-known man in the state, and probably the most well-known man in the country from 1870 to 1910 from Jacksonville, Florida. So at this time, I'm going to end this part, but I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Jameson, for allowing me to come in and share a little bit. Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge of Florida, we're celebrating our 150th anniversary this year. Our history is, like I said, symbiotic to the city of Jacksonville, to the state of Florida, and most importantly, Edward Waters College.
can't be underemphasized, the power of the African American community in Jacksonville at that time. And you might be saying to yourself, how are all these ministers becoming senators? This was an issue in the church. There were some bishops who thought that having these ministers that are supposed to be taking care of the people and ministering to their flock should not be involved in politics. They believed that it was inherently corrupting. So there was some tension amongst these people, but there were a group of these early ministers of the church that believed that the only way that the newly freed African Americans were going to have a chance was through education and through political power. The AME Church was really the NAACP of Florida. The NAACP wasn't sort of working at that time, it wasn't a national organization, but the church did the same thing that organizations like that later went on to do. So the power of the church, and again, its centrality to the story of Jacksonville can't be underemphasized. Can't be overemphasized. This is the president I was telling you about before, William B. Stewart, EWC's longest tenured president. This is what I consider to be the kind of classical era of EWC. In '55, the school receives its Southern Association of Colleges accreditation as a junior college. A couple of years later, EWC begins offering senior college coursework. So this is really the kind of the beginning of it being a school, a college, a four-year college for all people, and staying that way. Here are some of the ideas and plans for the area that we're in right now that were held during the Stewart administration. There was going to be a sort of an amphitheater there. There was going to be something where Shell Suite is today. There was going to be a walkway going over Kings Road. So there were all these plans that were in the works, and some of them could have come to fruition, but there were changes that were happening in America's educational system, we're going to talk about in a second, that would really forestall a lot of these ideas. But also during President Stewart's administration, the second Salter Hall was constructed. This is the new Salter Hall, built in 1954. Here we have also the construction of what's called the Hatcher Stewart building. If we walk across the street, named after board chairman Eugene Hatcher and William Stewart, the president of the time. So there we have Bishop Hatcher's wife cutting the ribbon. There we have the opening ceremony on that day and all the people there to greet this new expansion of EWC. And also during administration, the George Collins Student Union Building was constructed, otherwise known as the Sub. These are the ideas that they put in the yearbook. This was the vision before it was constructed. This was the idea of what it was going to look like, and it still looks very much like that today. These are the grounds back when it was being constructed, and that's George Collins, who it was named after.